Hey everybody! Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind you guys that I have a Star Wars Battlefront focused channel called Battlefront Max, which you can find the link to in the description down below. I review custom maps and mods for various Star Wars Battlefront games, so if you want more Star Wars goodness, then please head on over there and subscribe if you like what you see. The battle on Kashyyyk between the Clone Commandos, Shadow Troopers and Wookie resistance fighters against the Stormtroopers that were stationed at the crashed Republic ship continued. Fighting in the knee-deep water had taken its toll on some of the clones who had to slow their pace down as they got closer to the crash site. With reinforcements undoubtedly already being called in, it was essential to have the commandos begin to extract the data as fast as possible. For when they were done fighting these initial stormtroopers, the Shadow Troopers would have to set up defensive positions immediately without little preparation. What's more is that some of the Shadow Trooper officers feared that the Imperials might send in walkers to deal with the situation, and they were not well equipped at that moment to deal with something like that. But for the time being, they still had to deal with the leftovers from the initial clash. The stormtroopers that still resisted were the most battle-hardened, with the rookies and the experienced yet reckless having bit the dust first. But by now most of the battle had left the swampy waters and now took place on the muddy grounds right in front of the ship. It still made maneuvering difficult, with troopers getting their feet stuck in the mud, but at least they could traverse the area faster than in the water. This made it to where multiple troopers could flank and surprise the remaining stormtroopers, and though losses were still felt at the Republic's side, in the end, this initial clash was victorious for the clones. At the same time, on the other side of the galaxy, a different clash was about to commence. Recently gathered intel suggested that a droid invasion force would attack a rebel base. The rebels had sent a call for help to the Republic, but that help would not arrive in time. The CIS was already on the rebels' doorstep. The rebels often had used guerrilla-type warfare from smaller locations, meaning that a loss of a rebel camp or base usually wasn't too punishing since the overall damage was tiny. But this was one of their larger bases, and thus there was a lot on the line. The droids had arrived on the beach, backed up by multiple AATs, snail tanks, and even tri-droids. Hundreds of rebel troops had assembled at the shoreline and opened fire on the mechanical mass that had assembled before their eyes. And with an ear-deafening sound, all guns, turrets, and artillery began to rain down hell on the droids. With the first few moments being absolute chaos, the droids spread out across the beach while their armor tried to find openings and fire at the infantry that took theirs under fire. Beach invasions happened on multiple fronts throughout the galaxy, and the droids had one advantage that many other factions had not: the lack of fear. Though it was in a droid's programming to go prone or seek cover to avoid getting hit or destroyed, It would never be entangled by the feeling of fear. This made them deadly during invasions like this, as even though they got destroyed by the hundreds, they still were able to pick off a rebel target here or there. The real courageous rebels were the ones who manned the turrets out on the open beach or high up in the tower, though some believed it might not have been courage and instead they had no other choice but to man these by their higher-ups. But time for questions there was not, for the horde of droids still had not diminished despite still being grounded to the shore area. But by now several of the rebel turrets had been taken out, their manned infantry completely annihilated. The tanks and walkers also headed in slowly. It was difficult for some of them to ascend the steep rocks of the shore, but then again, that was not their current purpose. They had a better angle to immediately fire on any resistance they experienced from the enemy. The Tri-Droids in particular had great oversight. The rebel turrets were able to deal with the snail tanks fairly easily, but had trouble to take out the AATs. Some of the AATs were rendered immobile, but could still fire as static turrets, making them almost as deadly as they were before. The battle was going on for a while now, and was still in full effect. New waves of droids were being dropped in, and the remainders of the first had reached the first rocks, providing some much needed cover. They were chipping away at the rebel base defenses, while at the same time suffering huge losses. This would normally be disastrous for other factions or species of flesh and blood, but for droids, it was an everyday reality. There were still rebels miraculously inside some of the towers as they continued to fire in a panicked state. They had no choice but to stay in the tower, as descending would surely mean death, and at the same time, staying up there would be their death inevitably. More armor was rolling in. There were simply too many tanks to all advance inside the base. Most would hold down the shore once things have calmed down. The first row of defensive troopers had suffered quite a few losses, and rebel comms prepped the second line of defense to make ready. Blaster fire could already be seen coming from the beach area, but these units were dug in better and had a choke point to focus on, which would not let as many tanks through as the open beach. The sand at the shore had become scarred with wrecks of CIS tanks and droid parts. A beach full of destruction, yet absent of any blood except for the few rebels manning the turrets. Some of the rebels that were still alive from the beachfront retreated back towards the second line of defense. All their brothers and sisters died at the front, most never knowing where the killing shot came from. It was awfully quiet at the center, as the droids now got the order to full on charge, as their next battle would be as taxing in terms of numbers. The second defensive line would need to be taken mostly by infantry, since there was barely enough room for a tank to go through. If that tank would be destroyed, it could block the passage for more reinforcements. As the Tri-Droids would head in closer, they would provide covering fire from above. But for now, the rebels unleashed hell once more on the first of the droids that showed their metal heads. The dynamics of this battle would now shift, and the droids had set foot on rebel ground. But the war for this base was far from over.